Speaker. It is an honor here to rise again and continue my remarks on the cover-up budget 2019. You'll recall when I stood up at the outset of this debate on Monday, I said that I would be delighted to cede the floor at any time if only a member of the government speaking with the authority of the Prime Minister would enter this chamber and say definitively that the government was prepared to have a full Ethics Committee investigation into the SNC-Lavalin corruption scandal and subsequent cover-up. I said that investigation would have to include sworn testimony from all of those alleged to have interfered with the Attorney General's role in the matter of SNC-Lavalin. I told the House that I would cede the floor immediately upon receiving such a binding offer and that Conservative members would accept it and an investigation would go ahead. Allow me to provide some background to the House as to why I made that original offer. Mr. Speaker, you will recall the origins of this scandal happened in the budget of 2018. The Finance Minister presented an omnibus bill to implement his budget measures, and buried within it was an amendment to the Criminal Code, creating a new mechanism to offer deals to accused corporate criminals that would allow them to avoid criminal prosecution for such serious offenses as bribery, fraud, and corruption. At the time, members of the Finance Committee were astonished to find such a measure contained in a budget bill. It is extremely unusual for budget legislation to amend the Criminal Code. In fact, it may even be unprecedented. The Liberal member for Hull-Elmer said he did not think it was right. The chairman of the committee, himself an ardent, partisan, committed Liberal, said that the measure did not belong in a budget bill. The Liberal member for Hull-Elmer further said that based on his reading of the Criminal Code amendment that the Finance Minister had put in the budget bill, he said words to the effect of, if I steal $10, I'm in trouble, but if I steal 10 million, I'm just fine. Now, what struck us in that moment was the question, who is asking for this? I remember looking over at the member from the Okanagan, a Conservative who's with us, who was listening carefully today. He raised the concern that this should not be included in a budget bill, that it should be separate legislation, carefully studied, the consequences widely known before it became law. But no, the government was determined to push ahead with as little scrutiny as humanly possible. And so we all went home late that night with that mystery of who was driving this agenda. You know, all of us go out to our communities, we talk to people about their concerns, and we hear people say they're worried about the cost of living or healthcare wait times for their families or safety in their streets or you name it. We hear about it. But none of us had heard that there was a need to amend the criminal code so that corporate criminals could get off without conviction. That had never come up at any of the events I have attended, literally hundreds if not thousands of them, since I was elected almost a decade and a half ago. But somebody had to be driving this agenda, somebody powerful and influential. Powerful and influential enough to convince both the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister that such a criminal code amendment was needed. I have to say, there was a nagging part of me that wondered if maybe the Attorney General didn't like this criminal code amendment. Otherwise, she would have normally been the one to introduce it. She was also the Justice Minister. And while she is bound by cabinet solidarity and required thereby to publicly, anyway, support initiatives that the cabinet had decided upon, it was extremely unusual for her not to be the sponsoring minister for legislation changing the criminal code, a statute for which the Justice Minister has the carriage. And yet, the bill passed and became law. And it wouldn't be until February of this year when we found out who was driving the train on this bill. An explosive headline in the front page above the fold on the Globe and Mail said that the Prime Minister and his team had pressured the former Attorney General, by then moved out of her position, to grant SNC-Lavalin a settlement to avoid criminal prosecution. And then it all made sense. That late night session, that massive 500-page bill, that little tiny criminal code amendment tucked away at the very end, rushed through, no time to talk or discuss. We now knew where it all came from. SNC-Lavalin, a powerful Liberal-linked corporation which had given over $100,000 in illegal donations to the Liberal Party, funneled through the production of false invoices, phony bonuses, and deceptive receipts through employees into the Liberal Party coffers. That same SNC-Lavalin had successfully convinced the government to change the law, allowing for a settlement so that companies accused of serious white-collar crime could evade prosecution altogether. Unreal. There was a problem with the plan, though, Mr. Speaker. It started with a very accomplished Director of Public Prosecutions. You see, the bill requires that the top prosecutor agree that a company is entitled for that special deal in order for it to go ahead. She'd read the Act, even as the Liberals had written it when they introduced it, and concluded the company was not eligible. It did not qualify. Why? Because its crimes were too serious, because it did not report its own crimes, because the participants were the highest level of the executive management of the company, and because the company had done absolutely nothing to compensate the victims of the alleged $130 million of theft. These victims are among the poorest people in the world. The company is alleged to have stolen their money. It's a pretty miserable way to make a living, stealing from the poor. Fortunately, it's also an illegal way to make a living. At least we thought so. But the Prime Minister attempted to apply political pressure, the Globe and Mail reported, to let this company off without prosecution despite that fact. And so, what happened? The Prime Minister denied it all. The story's false. Full stop, end of story. Nothing more to say here. Bob Fife and Steve Chase, the reporters who wrote it, they got it all wrong. Must have made it all up. So was the Prime Minister's story. And on we moved, right? Wrong. Because it turned out it wasn't false. When the Prime Minister would go out days later and say the proof that the story was false was the continued presence of the former Attorney General in his cabinet, then as Veterans Affairs Minister, he said, her presence speaks for itself. Well, she couldn't stomach that anymore, so she resigned. And then her resignation spoke for itself. And so the Prime Minister began to make up a new story. that yes, he had pressured the former Attorney General, but that was okay. There was nothing wrong with a little bit of pressure. Because of relentless public pressure, the Prime Minister was forced to allow the former Attorney General to testify before the Justice Committee, where she laid out a spectacular chronology of political interference at the highest level, including the personal interference of the Prime Minister himself. He denied. And then the evidence arrived, demonstrating that, in fact, he and his top members had participated in pressuring and interfering with the former Attorney General. She provided text messages, written journal entries, and finally, an audio recording in order to demonstrate that everything she had said was true. And so the Prime Minister's story had to change again. He went out into the world and said, look, the Attorney General, according to the Prime Minister's minions, the former Attorney General, was just angry because she lost her dream job. Et c'est ça la raison pour laquelle.
And that's why she didn't want to keep working with the Prime Minister. And the only reason why she appeared to talk about political interference was because she was angry for having been removed from her dream job. So it was personal bitterness and not a principle nor the facts that caused her to speak out about the interference, political interference by the Prime Minister. We've heard talk about personal attacks. Liberals, like Sheila Copps, a prior Deputy Prime Minister. Others have called her a difficult person, a difficult woman. But we're happy that she was difficult, because when a Prime Minister attempts to interfere in the legal system, well, I hope that an Attorney General will be difficult. It's a good idea to be difficult if a Prime Minister attempts to corrupt the criminal system. Now, the Prime Minister needed to change his story once again. So he stood up to say that it was about the jobs. He interfered, but it was to save jobs and the headquarters or head office of the company. And we easily learned by looking at the internet that the corporate headquarters was not going to move because there was an agreement between the Caisse de dépôt and the corporation. And the agreement specifies that the corporation had to keep its office in Montreal for another 6 years in order to receive a $1.5 billion loan. So it was impossible, as the Prime Minister said and his team claimed, for the headquarters to move. What's more, the company just signed a 20-year lease for a building in Montreal. You don't sign a 20-year lease if you think you're going to move. The company had recently announced renovations to accommodate employees, a decision it would have never made if they were in the process of moving. So it was misrepresenting the facts by saying that the headquarters would move. Then the Prime Minister said 9,000 jobs will disappear if he hadn't interfered in the system. His best friend and former principal advisor, principal secretary, said it was so emotional for him. He needed to save those 9,000 jobs. That's what forced him to interfere in the system. The head of the Green Party asked, do you have a shred of proof, a single element of proof that 9,000 jobs will disappear if the process goes ahead? He said, nothing specific. Nothing specific. All of that interference over a period of 4 months with 20 points of contact to save these 9,000 jobs. And the principal secretary and best friend said, no, nothing specific to indicate that the 9,000 jobs were at stake. And he put the same question to the clerk of the Privy Council. Do you have reports showing that 9,000 jobs will disappear? No. We asked the Prime Minister at a press, or he was asked at a press conference, the Prime Minister, if there was proof that the jobs would disappear if the trial went forward. No. After all, the CEO himself said that he had never threatened to move the headquarters, nor indicated that 9,000 jobs would disappear. Construction projects need to take place where the projects are located. We know that here in Ottawa, SNC will be working on the light rail project. So you can't put in place 24 kilometers of rail in London or China and except in Canada's case to drop the products out of a helicopter onto the site. So these jobs wouldn't be moving. $52 billion of construction projects are underway in Canada and that need to be completed here. So jobs for contractual and physical reasons can't be moved. It was misrepresenting the facts at the highest levels in the Prime Minister's office. Now, it's one thing to interfere in a trial, in a criminal proceeding, to prevent the trial from going ahead. But it's even more serious to lie to an Attorney General to prevent something from going ahead. That breaches Section 139 of the Criminal Code. That section says that obstructing justice in and of itself constitutes an offense. It is a violation of the Criminal Code, and the Prime Minister is talking about jobs because that excuse has been discredited Everyone knows that it's an untruth. So it's another indication where he changed his story. And finally, he said, if the former Attorney General had had problems with this interference in the criminal proceedings, she should have said so. But she had never done so. But in her testimony, she said that she did. She stated directly to him, she said, I looked him in the eye and I said, are you interfering in my role as Attorney General? Because I strongly advise against that approach. She said that at the Justice Committee. And yesterday, in the House, the Prime Minister admitted that, yes, indeed, she had said those things. So he contradicted himself. He contradicted himself when he said that the Attorney General had never addressed his interference. So that's another change in his story. Mr. Speaker, when two people contradict themselves and you have to choose between one of them, sometimes the best way of knowing who's right is the one who doesn't change his or her story. Because the person who keeps changing his or her story is normally the one who's not telling the truth. And what I have shown during the hours and hours of debate is that the Prime Minister's story changed constantly. Even more quickly than he changes his socks. But the story, the version put forth by the former Attorney General, did not change. She said one thing about each fact, showed Canadians the text messages, her journal entries, her personal journal entries, and the recording of a conversation from December. And all the facts in those documents reinforce what she said before the Justice Committee in her testimony. But we can't assume that the story is behind us. What are the facts? There are people in the Prime Minister's office who interfered, and for months they were in contact with SNC-Lavalin. We should know, in fact, then, what and why they did what they did. Secondly, we need to look at whether the Prime Minister lied to Canadians on this matter. And thirdly, we need to know what the Prime Minister and the current Attorney General will do in the future. There's a great deal of evidence that both are open to or determined to give SNC-Lavalin an agreement to enable the company to avoid a criminal trial. If that is the case, if yes, then we need to know that before the next election. It's possible that the trial could continue until after the election without an answer. And I predict and I advise you, Mr. Speaker, that if the Prime Minister is re-elected before Christmas, we will see an agreement for SNC-Lavalin, enabling them to avoid justice on charges of fraud that are being alleged by our police forces. But Canadians should know before going to the polls before they go to vote, before they vote for the Prime Minister. Now, Mr. Speaker, all of these questions could be answered if the Liberal Party went to the Ethics Committee next Tuesday, where we will decide whether or not to proceed with an investigation. As I just said, I'd like to see a Liberal come in and say, yes, they will vote in favor of an investigation. There's no reason why the Prime Minister should deny this type of investigation. If there's nothing to hide, then it would be easy. There would be no problem. Canadians will see that he's as perfect as he claims to be. But if not, if there are secrets, well, I offer him this advice. It's best to get the secrets out now than to try to keep them hidden until a later point in time, because secrets are heavy. Each day one tries to hide them, bear the burden of these secrets, the more tired he will become. So let's allow Canadians to see what happened and what the Prime Minister and the Attorney General will do in the future. Because the choice is simple. Our current leader, our Conservative leader, said he will not interfere if elected. A Conservative government will not overturn the decision made by the former Attorney General as to how this trial will take place.
Know that we're much captivated by this actual scandal and the cover-up budget that is attempted to distract from it. The two are not entirely unrelated. In fact, they're related for two specific reasons. First, of course, the government thought it could distract from this scandal by simply spraying around an extra $41 billion in government spending, almost all of it paid for by deficits in the short run. This is what I call the Liberal three-step. Step one, massive scandal. Step two, massive deficit spending to distract from the scandal. And step three, massive tax increases to pay for it all after the election. But, so in that sense, these two issues are linked. The scandal is what convinced the government it needed to blow billions of dollars out the door right before the election and get everyone thinking and talking about something else. But there's a second reason they are linked. The reason why companies increasingly think that they can get ahead through their connections to this government is because the Prime Minister's philosophy is one of state economic control. He believes in an ever-growing government. Now, we are told whenever politicians on the far left decide to grow government, it's to replace greed with some government-directed altruism. We all agree, all of us, on all sides of the spectrum, that there is a human desire to improve one's lot, to have more and better tomorrow than today. In its benign form, we call this ambition. In excess, greed. Whatever word you use, it's part of human nature. In a recent speech, Socialist Senator Elizabeth Warren described it this way, and I quote, "In reality, billionaire investors and wealthy shareholders in powerful companies often have exactly three goals: maximize profit, maximize profit, maximize profit." End quote. But egalitarian socialism proposes to abolish this impulse from human nature altogether. All the money goes to the government, so everyone equally owns the government, and therefore everyone is equally rich or poor, and no one really moves back or forward relative to the pack, or so we're told. Ironically, both socialists and conservatives have accepted that this is what happens when government gets big enough. The former celebrate equal outcomes. The latter, decry the lack of incentive to work and produce industry that will result from government trying to eliminate any form of competition between peoples. Famously, Churchill once said, the inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings, and the inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. But is that what happens? Can socialism really expand government to control all the wealth so that it is shared equally by everyone? Can it grow so big that it can replace human nature itself? If so, we must accept the belief that the state can literally banish personal ambition and avarice from the human DNA. The government can grow so large that it not only replaces the private sector, but replaces human nature altogether. If so, are we the only species whose very nature governments can alter? Or can the state change other creatures as well, so that flies no longer feast on honey, nor ravens on the carrion of dead gazelles, nor fish such as pike feed more on floating garbage, nor the greedy client feed from the lords of the state? You need to answer yes to believe socialism is capable of changing the self-seeking human desires. The alternative explanation, the alternative theory, comes from the great Nobel Prize-winning economist James Buchanan. He developed something called public choice theory, which he called politics without the romance. To quote the Wall Street Journal on him, Buchanan described public choice theory as the application of the profit motive to government. It presupposes that if there is value to be gained through politics, persons will invest resources in efforts to capture this value. Now, in the market, profit seekers invest in commercial enterprises to gain wealth. But in government-controlled economics, he invests in the political influence to gain wealth. Now, Buchanan wrote this: however, when governmental machinery directly uses almost 1/3 of national product, when interest groups clearly recognize the profits to be made through political action, and when a substantial proportion of all legislation exerts measurably differential effects on separate groups of the population, an economic theory can be a great help in pointing towards some of the means through which these conflicting interests may be ultimately recognized. End quote. Where people act rationally in a market economy, investing in order to get a return, Dr. Buchanan found that government-controlled economies have the exact same type of calculated trade-offs. People invest in politics in order to get rich. In fact, The only thing that changes is the way one gets rich. The way one gets rich in a government economy is by winning the favor of the political decision makers who allocate the resources. Instead of selling things that people agree to buy, one buys the politicians who control the money. If all the money is in the great vault of the state, profiteers work at buying or renting the keys to that vault. They donate to politicians who give them subsidies. They offer luxurious vacations to prime ministers in exchange for grants to their foundations. They hire lobbyists to convince governments to shut down their competitors with more regulation and tariffs. Buchanan wrote, "The individual who seeks short-term pleasure through consumption of modern items in the market is precisely the same individual who will seek partisan advantage through political action." In the book Welfare for the Well-to-Do, economist Gordon Tullock put it this way: "Today, the individual who works hard and thinks carefully in order to make money in the market will also work hard and think carefully in order to use the government to increase his wealth. Thus, we should anticipate that efforts and ingenuity would be put into using the government for gain. And if we look at the real world, we do indeed see such activities," end quote. Therefore, the larger the government becomes, the more we can expect profit seekers to turn their money into power and turn that power back into yet more money. We see this here in Canada. In 2017, there were 23,000 lobbying interactions with designated public office holders in the federal government, a 79% increase in just 3 years, which just happened to coincide with a 20% increase in government spending. Wow. What do you know? The two fastest growing sectors in the economy now are government and lobbying, which are two sectors that grow hand in hand. South of the border is no different, Mr. Speaker. The American company Strategas Partners Research produced a graph, fascinating graph, showing the correlation between the amount of money American business spends on lobbyists and the share of the U.S. federal government as a part of the GDP. And what did it show? That as the U.S. government in Washington gets bigger, the amount of money U.S. companies spend on lobbying that government. In 2000, federal spending in the U.S. was about 19% of GDP, and there was about $2 billion worth of lobbying. By 2009, a decade later, government spending had grown to 25% of GDP, almost a third bigger. And real lobbying had nearly doubled in inflation-adjusted terms to $4 billion. More money in the government in Washington, more money spent on lobbyists to get that money from Washington. Looks like Elizabeth Warren was right. Corporations seek profit, 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 profit. What she did not tell us is that they are just as capable of seeking that profit from big government. It makes sense. When government decides who gets what, business buys a bigger share of government. Who wins when that happens? Well, of course, it is those with money. They can hire the best lobbyists, promise future jobs to politicians, make donations, and schmooze the officials. The working class, by contrast, can afford none of these things. They're too busy trying to keep their heads above water, raise their kids, take them to hockey and soccer. They don't have the financial means to hire lobbyists and accumulate and leverage political influence. Let me give you an example of the payoff. Bombardier invested in lobbyists and got a $400 million interest-free loan from this Liberal government. And this is how it worked. Government gave them the $400 million interest-free loan, so the company did not have to raise the money in equity markets. Why was that so important? Because the billionaire Bombardier Baudouin family wanted to stay majority controllers of the company. They own 53%. If they had sold more shares, they would have diluted their interest below a majority control and would no longer be in charge of the family business. Less than 50% means you no longer choose management, and you don't get to pass the business as a family heirloom from one person to another. And what did Canadian taxpayers get for this corporate welfare? Well, not very much. It turns out the company moved the jobs to South Carolina, sold the IP to Europe, but left the bill with Canadian taxpayers. The only winners were the billionaires. So yes, the lady bagging groceries at the corner store had to pay higher taxes to fund a bailout to a billionaire feudal family who were in charge of this family, of this company only because of their political connections to this government. Look elsewhere. Private equity funds and investment bankers have invested in lobbyists, and guess what they got? A $15 billion infrastructure bank to protect their investments in infrastructure mega projects. You know, if a banker asked you for $1,000, you'd say, what for? The Liberal government is asking for basically $1,000 from every Canadian family in order to set up this infrastructure bank. So what is it for? Let's go through the possible explanations of what it could possibly be for. Well, the first is that it would fund infrastructure. But private banks, capital markets, pension funds, private equity enterprises already bankroll billions of dollars of infrastructure projects. And they will invest $2 trillion more worldwide if we believe the estimates in the government's own fall economic update. So with so much private money already invested in infrastructure, the last thing we should need is another government bank to provide more. So that can't be the reason. Perhaps we need the new bank to bridge those private dollars into public projects, like mass transit. Yet, here again, the government's own fall economic update indicates that those investments are already happening without the bank. It cited the $2 billion Canada Line, the biggest public transit project at the time in Canadian history. It moves to 120,000 passengers daily between Vancouver's downtown suburbs and the airport, with investments from large private sector and commercial interests. For example, the Quebec Caisse de Dépôt invests in that Vancouver project. So Quebec pensioners help build mass transit for British Columbians whose transit fares help pay Quebec pensioners. And yet, that all happened without an infrastructure bank. Just as the privatization of the 407 highway happened without an infrastructure bank. Just as the privatization of the Canadian National Railway happened without a government-owned infrastructure bank. So what's this bank for? I keep knocking down the possible explanation. But we got one. The Canadian Electricity Association made a submission to the House of Commons Transport Committee on how the bank should work. And here's what it said. Also important is the inclusion of de-risking mechanisms, such as loan guarantees. Bingo! There's the reason. In one sentence, the power companies explained the real purpose of the bank. Taxpayer-funded guarantees that protect investors from losses. Indeed, the government bill that creates the infrastructure bank uses the term loan guarantee 14 times. So the power companies are onto something. Their submission uses the term de-risking, de-risk, or reduce risk about 5 times. The prefix D implies the bank can delete the risk, like a magician can make a grenade disappear. You know, when you have a grenade, there's a chance that it could explode. But this de-risking magic can make it just vanish into thin air. Wrong. It doesn't disappear. It just takes the grenade from the company and puts it in the lap of Mr. and Mrs. Taxpayer. So it doesn't de-risk, it relocates the risk. right? So now we know why they need an infrastructure bank. Years ago, institutional investors could get taxpayer-funded returns from sleepy government bonds, but interest rates have been so low for so long that the only way to make real money is to invest in riskier ventures like building power plants, for example. As J.P. Morgan Asset Management report indicated, merchant power generation pays 14 to 20% returns. But here's the problem. Its risk category is high. Cost overruns, revenue shortfalls, construction delays, labor disputes could cause major losses unless you have a new government bank that agrees to take all that risk off of your back. Currently, governments force builders to cover cost overruns on construction projects through fixed price contracts. And they force those companies to buy bankruptcy insurance to keep projects on budget if the contractor goes under. I know this personally because we had an essential piece of infrastructure under construction, a bridge connecting connecting east and west Ottawa deep in the south end of the city. And the builder went broke. But the good news was all the risk was on the company's back, and the company had to hire a bonding company to take over the project if the major proponent went underground. In other words, the taxpayer did not pay for cost overruns, and while there was a delay, the people who pay their bills every day, the taxpayers of Canada, did not pay the price. The company did, and the bonding company did, but not with the new infrastructure bank. Testifying before the Commons Transport Committee, the top public servant responsible for the bank described the tool as existing for, quote, underwriting sophisticated, highly complex projects. The word underwriting comes from the 17th century London insurers who would literally write their names under a list of cargo on board a shipping vessel. If the ship sank, so did the underwriter's money. Taxpayers could sink billions of dollars by underwriting infrastructure projects with this new bank. Guess what? Guess who's involved in the infrastructure bank? It's a three-letter word. SNC. The bank, though it has a well-paid CEO and fancy offices in Toronto, which, by the way, do not comply with the Official Languages Act, has only one project to its name, and of course, SNC-Lavalin is right in the middle of it. Wow. No surprise there. Now, it is easy to imagine why SNC-Lavalin and other wealthy investment bankers and private equity fund managers would want this arrangement. But what's not clear is why would a government elected by taxpayers agree? Well, at closed-door meetings in Davos, New York, and Toronto, and in direct talks with officials, the most powerful financial interests on earth have directed this government on how the bank should work. It's the golden rule of the Liberal government. Those who have the gold make the rules. And their rules are simple. They get the rewards, taxpayers get the risk. Now that we know what and who the bank is for, those who will pay the price must fight to stop it. Now, it's not just the infrastructure bank. Some technology companies have invested in lobbyists, and they have been able to secure brand new billion-dollar corporate welfare funds called superclusters. Here in Ontario, at a provincial level, we saw the worst kind of these kinds of self-licking ice cream cones, where a commercial interest pays a lobbyist, which influences a politician to pay the commercial interest, and the commercial interest uses some of that money to pay the lobbyist to influence the politician. and on and on and go. It's a self-licking ice cream cone, and it has never been so big and so sumptuous as it is under this government.
That's right.
And actually, that's not fair. There was the Ontario government under Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty. Here in Ontario, wait a sec here. Somebody yelled, what about the Harper government? You know, I want to point that out. Because there was something like 70% less lobbying going on around this place, according to the registry, when Harper was in charge and the size of government was shrinking. And you know the one place that went out of business? High Steakhouse went out of business. You think that is a coincidence? Now, God bless the good people who worked there. They were wonderful people, but it was a hangout for the lobbyists and the power brokers. And isn't it just fascinating that it was right in the middle of the Harper tenure that the place became so tired and so sleepy and so uninhabited that it no longer could afford to pay its bills. You know, these kinds of places are popping up all over Ottawa now because the good times for the lobbyists and the insiders are rolling like they haven't in years. But we know where the Liberal government gets its lessons. In Ontario, we learned the largest corporate donor to the Ontario Liberal Party gave the party $480,000, in exchange for which it got $160 million in government handouts. What a return on investment, my friends. John Pierpont Morgan, the Rockefellers, Warren Buffett couldn't dream of getting that kind of return on investment. $480,000 to turn around $160 million in corporate welfare. And then there's the Green Energy Act, a deliberate government decision to pay 80 cents for a kilowatt hour of solar electricity that is worth 3 cents. The province has already forced consumers to overpay by $37 billion to buy unneeded, unreliable, and overpriced electricity from well-connected power companies. That is why hydro prices have risen by 100% in just over a decade. Now, who wins and who loses? Because remember, when governments get big, it's supposed to be really tough on the rich and good for the poor, we're told, right? Well, who won in this? Well, the rich power companies, they made off with massive profits because the government forced people to overpay them for their unneeded power. But who lost? The poorest people lost. Electricity is a larger share of their household budgets than it is for the rich. And the Ontario Association of Food Banks called it energy poverty. In 1 year, 60,000 people had their power cut for failure to pay. When the Ontario Attorney General looked at it, she predicted another $133 billion in overpayments between now and 2032 because of the Liberal government's Green Energy Act. That is a total of $170 billion the government is forcing Ontario consumers to overpay above market prices throughout a 25-year period, making it literally the single biggest wealth transfer from the working poor to the super rich in the history of Canada. Never has any government in my lifetime taken so much from so many to give to so few. All this follows countless donations and third-party advertising from the very companies that got all the electricity contracts. We see examples of big socialist governments using the power of the states to take from the poor and the working class and give to the rich and powerful all the time. And now we have something called the Clean Fuel Standard. Sounds very similar to the Green Energy Act. And what will it do? It actually has nothing to do with cleaning fuel, unlike the name. All it does is require those who sell gasoline to pay credits to well-connected people who are able to sell those credits for supposedly green things that are happening in some other place in the world. And of course, there will be all kinds of greasy middlemen who will grab one piece after another of that action as it goes flying by. So just like the Win Liberals did to your electricity bill, this government will do to your gas bill. And of course, gasoline is a much bigger share of a family budget for a poor family than for a rich family, so it is yet another disgusting wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. But Macaulay, the great poet, warned of this. He said, Macaulay said, he wrote one of his great poems, he said, wherever you shed the honey, the buzzing flies will crowd. Wherever you fling the carrion, the raven's croak is loud. Wherever down Tiber garbage floats, the greedy pike you see. And wheresoever such lord is found, such client still will be. Wow. You know, isn't it funny he chose flies as his example on honey? Because flies don't make honey. They consume honey. The same way the parasitical interests that profit off of big government don't make any of the wealth they consume, but they sure are fantastic at consuming it. That's right. That's right. It is bees that make honey. And isn't it interesting that bees make honey in a process that is very similar to transactions in a free market economy? Bees do this in a mutually beneficial exchange between plant and insect. The plant provides the nectar, which the bee transforms into honey, and the bee pollinates the plant so that it can reproduce. That is the very nature of the free market transaction, where both participants always win. And we know they win because they're voluntarily participating in it. And these are the fundamental truths of the two different approaches to economic transaction. Every transaction, every single one in the free market is voluntary. Every transaction done by the government is done by force. Even when government spends on worthy causes that we all support, the military, for example, it does so through the forceful collection of taxes. And as government expands, force expands. As free markets expand, free choice expands. We understand that this is the only distinction between the two systems. We realize that almost everything we have been taught to the contrary is wrong. So when Elizabeth Warren and socialists like us warn us that those powerful companies search out new prey moving up and down their own food chain, I'm quoting here, she is making allusion to the law of the jungle. But it is the government economy, the government-run economy based on force and the power of the state. It is in that economy that the strong can use their money and power to prey on the weak. By contrast, in a system where every exchange is voluntary, based on the consent of both participants, such as a free market, it is impossible for anyone to prey on anyone else. No business in a free market can force the poor person to work for it or buy its products. That person only does so when he or she voluntarily agrees. Let me use the example of the Apple Store. Apple has been said to be the most powerful company on planet Earth, with a market capitalization of almost $1 trillion, depending on the fluctuations of the stock market. But if a boy whose net worth is $1,000 from mowing lawns throughout the summer walks into an Apple store, some of our socialist friends would say, how could this possibly be a fair transaction? Here we have on the one hand a company worth $1 trillion, and on the other, a young boy worth just 1,000. In other words, one is literally 1 billion times bigger than the other. How could they possibly exchange a free negotiation? And the answer is, when he walks into that store, he is literally just as powerful as the company. because they cannot get his $1,000 unless they offer him something that is more valuable to him than the money he has to pay to get it. In that sense, they have to obsess over making his life better. It is the only system of government where you must make someone else better off in order to be better off yourself. Now, presume that Apple took a different approach and decided to try and get rich off a government subsidy. Would that boy be equal to the company? Would they then be on a level playing field? Of course not. The company could hire lobbyists, could make donations, could cozy up to politicians, could have articles placed in newspapers, could run advertising, whereas in order to get a government subsidy at the expense of that young taxpayer whose net worth is only $1,000. And in that sense, the company would be far more powerful than that young person. That is the law of the jungle, not the free market. Any relationship based on force favors the strong over the weak. We know this, Mr. Speaker, from the most simple and elemental facts of life. If I have an apple and want an orange, you have an orange and want an apple, we trade. And we are both better off because each has something more valuable than he had before. That is, even though between us, we just have an apple and an orange. And that is the miraculous power of the free market economy. It is the voluntary exchange of work for wages, product for payment, and investment for interest. These voluntary exchanges happen literally trillions of times every day in the free market parts of the world, and every single time they do, both participants are made better off. And if you think this is just theory, look at the facts. Dr. Q.J. Cribria, a Princeton-trained economist, compared the poverty rate to the size of government in 40 different developing countries. For each increase in the size of government as a share of GDP, the percentage of people living on less than $1.90 a day increased on average 41%. In other words, bigger governments, even in the developing parts of the world, lead to more poverty, in spite of the fact that we are constantly told that these countries are poor because the state is not big enough, that it is not doing enough, and that it is not spending enough. In fact, the data shows precisely the opposite. And what is true in the developing world is true also in the developed world. Dr. Tanzi, a former IMF policy director, Harvard-trained, conducted similar research on developed countries and found countries where government is less than 40% of GDP have significantly better outcomes on the UN Development Index than countries where the government represents more than 50% of GDP. The two Asian countries that are the best ranked on the Human Development Index are Singapore and Hong Kong, countries with no natural resources. They actually have to import their own water. They live on land masses which are the fraction of the size of the city of Ottawa, with many multiples of the number of people. And yet they have the highest standard of living of any of the countries in the Asian world. Now, our critics will point out quickly that they have housing crisis. They'll forget, of course, that's because they're the most densely populated places in the world. But I'll point out that while the housing there is extremely expensive, it's basically the only thing the government controls. And so those countries, too, know the difference between, inside those countries, we can see the difference between the immense power of the free market to improve people's lives and the constraints that heavy and excessive government places to the contrary. They demonstrate, those countries, apart from that exception, that they, with governments that represent less than 20% of GDP, have incomes that are equal to or superior to countries around the world that have far longer to develop and far more natural resources with which to do it. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, the free market system has generated more wealth than any other system ever contemplated. But unfortunately, it has had one failing. We have allowed, those of us who advocate this system have allowed the other side, those who believe in expanding the force and control of the state, to steal key words. And I'm here today to take them back. Let's start with the word empathy. The free enterprise not only allows empathy, it requires it. The only way to make a profit in that system is to offer something that is more valuable to a person than they have to pay to get it. There is no one more empathetic than the entrepreneur to his customer, because he knows that when that customer comes into his shop, he needs to do everything in his power to make that customer happy. That is not something that any politician can claim, because at the end of the day, these politicians across the way make their living and grow their operation by the forceful collection of taxes. The reason why businesses and entrepreneurs in the free market system have to be so empathetic to their customers is because they have to sell them things through a voluntary transaction. And that means, empathy means seeing through the other person's eyes. And the trick to sales is, if you want to sell what John Smith buys, you have to see through John Smith's eyes. Yes. That is the oldest expression in sales. Now let's take back another word that they have wrongly expropriated over there on the socialist side: diversity. They believe in anything but diversity. They want government control to snuff out diversity. They just kicked 2 members out of their caucus because those women were speaking up and their voices brought too much diversity for this government to handle. The greatest thing about the free market is that it is in a constant state of mutation to accommodate every diverse and particular need. I flew from Ottawa to Toronto recently with a constituent whose 80-person company has made a business of helping companies do billing and marketing in Braille and large print with no government subsidy, all because businesses want access to the visually impaired market. Compare that to the inflexible and lumbering government school system that cannot provide basic IBI treatment under the previous Liberal government, under most governments, for autistic children, despite billions of dollars of money spent. Let's take more. Let's give another example. Tolerance. Let's take back the other word, tolerance, right? Tolerance exists in a place and in a system called the free market, which ruthlessly punishes the bigoted employer. No system more ruthlessly punishes bigotry in an employer than the one that makes him pay a price for turning down the best employee because of irrelevant characteristics such as race, gender, and sexual orientation. The free market ensures that there is always a built-in incentive, an imperfect one, but incentive no less, to promote and hire based on merit, and to treat every customer in the best possible way. Yes, we need strong civil rights protections in law, but at the same time, we also need to recognize that the greatest protector of all of our services is when we have entrepreneurial, free enterprise competition that requires entrepreneurs to reach out and serve both workers and customers. And so here is the ultimate difference between the two systems. You can have a free market where businesses get ahead by having the best product, not a government economy where they get ahead by having the best lobbyists, where entrepreneurs make money by pleasing customers, not a government economic system where they get by pleasing politicians or government officials, where the underdog gets the same chance as the fat cat, the challenger the same opportunity as the incumbent, and that we can all advance based on meritocracy, not aristocracy. I would conclude today, if this Prime Minister had not decided that government had to be at the center of every economic decision, maybe SNC-Lavalin and others like it would not think that the way they get ahead is by relentlessly lobbying for special breaks and special deals. We on this side of the House of Commons will replace this centralized, government-controlled system of crony capitalism and corporatism with a new free market agenda that will allow everyone to get ahead on their own merit, a system where everybody can get ahead and move forward, a system that puts people before government. Thank you. And in conclusion, I move, second by the opposition House Leader, that the motion be amended by deleting all the words after the word "that" and substituting the following. The House reject the budget since it is an attempt to bury the SNC-Lavalin scandal under tens of billions of dollars of brand new spending for which Canadians will pay through higher taxes if the government is re-elected. Thank you.